It's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote debate for today, Robert Spencer and Shadid Lewis. Robert is the director of Jihad Watch, a program of the David Horowitz Freedom Center, and the author of 12 books, including 2 New York Times bestsellers, The Truth About Muhammad and The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades. His latest books are Did Muhammad Exist? An Inquiry into Islam's Obscure Origins, and Not Peace But a Sword, The Great Chasm Between Christianity and Islam. He has led seminars on Islam and Jihad for the United States Central Command, United States Army Command, and the General Staff College, the U.S. Army's Asymmetric Warfare Group, the FBI, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and the U.S. Intelligence Community. Also with us is Shadid Lewis, USA Regional Director of the Muslim Debate Initiative. He is the former president of the Islamic Research and Propagation Center in Comparative Religious Studies. He has studied and completed courses in Sciences of Quran, Islamic Family Law, and Studies of Understanding Hadith, and the American Open Islamic University of Fairfax, Virginia. Please welcome Robert and Shadid. To debate our keynote topic, Is Islam a Religion of Peace? Shadid will begin with 15 minutes to argue in the affirmative. Shadid.
Greetings to you all. To the Muslims in the audience, Assalamu alaikum. In the name of Allah, most beneficent, most merciful. We're here to discuss the topic, Is Islam a religion of peace? What is the meaning of peace? According to the dictionary, the meaning of peace is a state of tranquility or quiet, freedom from civil disturbance, a state of security or order within a community provided for by law or custom, freedom from disquieting or oppressive thoughts or emotions, harmony in personal relations, a state or period of mutual concord between governments, a pact or agreement to end hostilities between those who have been at war or in a state of enmity. Keep these definitions in mind as I proceed to make my case to answer the question, is Islam a religion of peace? Now, today we heard many things from many of the earlier speakers that I would say were outright incorrect about Islam. If, according to one of the earlier speakers, that Islam is the Boston bombing and 9/11 and Bali, can I then say that America is the Gulf War, the invasion of Panama, where 3,000 people, innocent Panamanian civilians, were killed? Can I then say that this is representative of America? Can I say that America is the invasion of Grenada, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Korea, World War I and II, the Civil War, Jim Crow segregation? Can I say this is representative of America, that America is not a nation of peace because for almost just about every decade there's some type of war era, there's some war going on? If you would say no, then of course then you cannot try to categorize Islam by these incidents. Furthermore, we're here to talk about the question, is Islam a religion of peace? However, when we look at our own nation, and I'm all for defense spending, I believe every nation has a right to defend itself. But did you know that the United States alone counts for over 2/5, or just under half, of the world's spending on military expenditures? No Arab country or no Middle Eastern country even comes close to that budget. Did you know that the United States alone has a military budget of $806 billion that we spend towards war expenditures, and things of this nature? Did you know that if you compared the countries that are considered the axis of evil, which would be Iran, Iraq, Libya, Syria, North Korea, they have a combined military spending of only $15 billion. So when you hear the question, about the threat of Islam, the internal threat, the outside threat, if they even had such an idea, they wouldn't have the money or the budget to even try to mount such a war against you. They would run out of money, and the United States would still have plenty of money to go forward in military expenditures. But we're here to talk about Islam, right? So, again, recall the definition that I gave of the meaning of peace. One of the meanings was a state of tranquility or quiet. Islam does indeed offer spiritual peace. For example, in the Quran, chapter 13, verse 28, it says, and also we heard this earlier, Al talked about the relationship in Islam that Allah, He has love, but, He's not your friend, and you can't have this personal type of relationship. Well, look what the Quran says. The Quran says, those who believe and whose hearts are set at rest or peace by the remembrance of Allah. Now, surely by Allah's remembrance are the hearts set at peace and rest. The Quran tells us in chapter 2, verse 45, seek help in patience and prayer. Truly, it is hard, save for the humble-minded. Seeking help in patience and prayer. When times are tough, like now with our economy, Islam says, turn to God, and you will find rest in God, and God will help you in your struggles. Quran says in chapter 76, verse 26, and a part of the night, prostrate yourselves to Him and glorify Him a long night through prayer through the night. This is definitely speaking of a spiritual peace and gaining a closeness or relationship with God. But of course, I know most people, you're not interested in that. You want to know about the war and the violence, right? So let's get to it. What are Islamic teachings on peaceful relations with others? Now, before I get into it, so that all the things that I say are not thrown to the side and my speech is in vain, let me deal with a couple of issues. Number one, we heard Mr. Thomas speak about taqiyya, claiming that there is this so-called doctrine of deception that Muslims are allowed to lie if it helps Islam. I'll quote my opponent. He says, speaking in a video to Nabil Qureshi, he says, the doctrine of deception, or doctrine of deceiving unbelievers, making them think Islam teaches, or that Muslims in any particular situation believe something other than what they really believe. This is my opponent, Robert Spencer. The fact is, there is no such teaching. Islam does not teach that you can lie to promote Islam. I hope you hear this. That is a complete lie itself. Islam does not teach that you can lie to promote Islam. What is taqiyya? Matter of fact, although I don't have my like the other authors have my books outside, I'll do a small plug. I do have a video that I produced. You can get it on Amazon. It's called Taqiyya. What does it mean and how it has been misused to demonize Muslims? You can find it on Amazon, all right? Unfortunately, I didn't bring any copies today. But just so you don't want to take my word for it, what do the teachings of Islam say? Literally, Taqiyya means to safeguard or to defend yourself in fear, okay? It is said that al-taqiyya with the tongue is with the tongue only. He who has been coerced into saying which angers Allah. In other words, taqiyya is a concept when a Muslim's life is in immediate danger. Let's say there's a persecution going on and there's some random killers hunting Muslims down. And so a guy comes to me and I say, oh, I take my hat off, put it away. We're killing Muslims. What are you? Are you a Muslim, Shadid? I'll kill you right now if you say yeah. I say, me? No, I'm not a Muslim. So that way he doesn't kill me. It's not to promote Islam. In fact, if taqiyya has to be acted, a person would not even mention Islam. But this is only when you're in immediate danger, and as it says, when one is coerced. Okay? And many of the scholars say this. Okay? For example, we have from Sunan al-Bahaki, Ibn Abbas says that, referring to one of the verses that supposedly mentions taqiyya, he says, anyone who after accepting faith in Allah utters unbelief, those who have been coerced, and as such uttered with their tongues that which their hearts did not confirm. This is what it is. It is not in an irregular situation like right now. Nobody's threatening me. Nobody has said they're going to kill me if I don't say what Islam teaches. No, it is when your life is in immediate danger. Okay, hopefully everyone understands. If not, let me give you a better example. Everyone may be familiar with Grey's Anatomy, right? The doctor show. There was an episode where there was a killer going through the hospital, and he was killing people, but he was only killing surgeons. If you were a nurse or a pediatrician, he would leave you alone. So he goes into one of the rooms, and there's two surgeons, one hiding under the bed, one in the closet. Maybe you've seen the episode. So he finds the one in the closet, And he says, what are you? The guy says, I'm a surgeon. He said, please, but don't shoot me, don't shoot me. And he shot him. So he finds the other one under the bed. He drags her from under the bed. And he says, what are you? Are you a surgeon? She said, no, I'm a nurse. He said, okay. And he walked away and let her go. He kept on looking for surgeons. That would be an example of taqiyya, where her life was in danger. So she said, look, I'm not a surgeon, so he wouldn't kill her. It's not lying about Islam to cover up something. That would be such a foolish teaching. Anyone could just read and say, oh, look, you just lied to me, sir. Here's what it says in the Quran or whatever. So no, there's no such teaching, okay? And again, if I need to go further, I can give you more. But let's get to the next thing. The next thing that was mentioned earlier was the abrogation. They claim that all the peaceful verses have been abrogated. This is an incorrect position. Yes, there are some scholars who claim that, but these scholars are incorrect, and I can name you the scholars who tell them they're wrong. Number one, first of all, in order for there to be, and the verses to be abrogated, you need proof. You can't just say, oh, it's abrogated because I feel like it. There has to be proof for abrogation. Either Allah has to say that a particular verse, don't give me something general that speaks of the idea of abrogation. No, in order to say a verse has been abrogated, you need direct proof. In other words, you need a statement that clearly says, this verse has been abrogated by this verse. And you will not find that concerning the verses that I'm going to mention, which we call the verses that demonstrate peace. Here's what some of the scholars say. In the book Science of Quran by Ahmed van Defner, he says that still others hold that there are no genuine reports available on the issue that go back to the Prophet. In other words, Muhammad, there's no statement from Muhammad where he can say, where you can quote that he says, yes, all the peaceful verses have been abrogated, or this verse has been abrogated by this other verse, canceling out the verses of peace. Okay? Some of the scholars, Imam Tabari
5 minutes, Shadid.
Okay. Imam Tabari says that this idea that the opinion that the kindness was abrogated by later Quranic statements make no sense. So let's get to the heart of the matter. Okay? What about everyday peaceful relations with Muslims? With others. The Quran says in chapter 60, verse 8, that Allah does not forbid you being good or kind to those who have not fought you because of your religion or driven you from your homes, or from being just towards them. Allah loves those who are just. Quran chapter 5, verse 8 says, O you who believe, stand out firmly for Allah as witnesses to fair dealing, and let not the hatred of others towards you make you swerve to wrong and depart from justice. Be just, that is next to piety, and fear Allah, for Allah is well acquainted with what you do. We heard the verse about the friends. Well, that's really not a good translation because the word there is not friends. The word there actually is wali. The correct translation is don't take them as your guardians or protectors. As Mustafa mentioned earlier, the Quran actually puts a condition. It says it is against those who fight you that you should not take as friends. The Quran clarifies that, and this is actually the correct interpretation of the Quran. The scholars of the interpretation of the Quran say that the best interpretation of the Quran is to use the Quran to interpret itself. In other words, use other verses to interpret other verses. Regardless of what some outside book, regardless of the opinion of a scholar, the best translation of the Quran or interpretation is to use other verses of the Quran to interpret, and that's what Brother Mustafa did earlier. The Quran clarifies what it means by don't take as guardians or protectors. It's referring to those who are being hostile towards you, who are trying to fight you. Okay? Are the Muslims commanded to make unending war on unbelievers? The Quran in chapter 2, verse 190 says, and fight in the way of Allah against those who fight against you, but be not aggressive. Surely Allah loves not the aggressors. We have a hadith in Bukhari where the Prophet is said to say, do not wish to meet the enemy. However, if you do face the enemy, be patient. He's telling the believers, don't wish for fights, don't wish for war. And again, remember, these verses have not been abrogated. The Quran talks about fighting for a just cause. It says, and why should you not fight in the cause of Allah and for those who lack power and are being oppressed? Men, women, and children whose cry is, our Lord, rescue us from this place whose people are oppressors, and raise for us from you one who will protect, and raise from us one who will help. The Quran also further clarifies, to those against whom war is made, permission is given to fight. Well, everybody agrees with that, right? Even the United States. If our country is attacked, don't we agree that we have the right to fight back and defend ourselves? Well, this is what the Quran has said. These are the conditions in which Quran talks about fighting and war and things of this nature. I have more verses, but for the sake of time, let's go on to the next. Do you know that Islam permits peace treaties? Remember, the definition of peace was what? Peace agreements between governments to end war, or mutual agreement to end enmity. Well, the Quran agrees. Islam agrees with that. We have Ibn Jarir at-Tabari writes in his book of Jihad, he says, Muslim jurists agree unanimously that the Messenger of Allah made peace with the polytheists of the Quraysh. And by the way, peace does not mean that you are in subjection. Peace does not mean that you have to subject yourself to some humiliating concepts or that you have to pay the jizya. In fact, the scholars say that on the day of Hudaybiyah, that the Prophet concluded a peace treaty with the polytheists on the day of Hudaybiyah without them having to pay to him a tribute or a tax.
1 minute.
Okay? Thus, they say that the Messenger of Allah did not find fault with peace agreements. So it's clear that Islam indeed is a religion of peace. Not passivity now. Not passivity, but peace. These are clearly peaceful injunctions. You must agree. Okay? So as I said, remember again that these peaceful verses have not been abrogated. I'm sure that's going to be brought up, but I can bring more and more scholars who clearly will make the case that the idea that the peaceful verses have been abrogated is the wrong opinion. Okay? And again, Muhammad never said it. Allah never said the peaceful verses are abrogated at all. Okay? So as I read to you, these are the verses that we see that clearly enjoin peaceful relations with non-Muslims, that they are clearly verses that when it speaks of fighting in a just cause, against oppression, when you've been attacked, against wrong, people who are oppressing other people or trying to oppress you. These are the reasons. And as we go on, I'll even bring you some more opinions from scholars that indeed make the case.
Thank you, Shadid. You can have a seat. And Robert, 15 minutes.
Thank you. I thought that since my appearance here today was so controversial, I decided not to show up. And I decided instead to base my remarks today entirely on the teachings and statements of various Islamic texts and Islamic scholars. And perhaps they're all wicked Islamophobes in disguise, I don't know. But in any case, it will be their words. In the first place, there is a problem. It all sounds so neat, and it all sounds so obvious when we hear these smooth presentations from Mr. Lewis and Mr. Akyol, and yet we know that there are Muslims who are committing acts of violence every day around the world and ascribing them to the teachings of the Quran and Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, and the various schools of Islamic law and the various sects of Islam. A few examples. The Taliban terrorist Baitullah Masood, he said, Allah on 480 occasions in the Holy Quran exhorts Muslims to wage jihad. We only fulfill God's orders. Only jihad can bring peace to the world. Now, you might think, well, he means jihad like the internal spiritual struggle, and then you remember this guy is the Taliban. They blow up girls' schools. They commit various atrocities against their own people as well as the American soldiers in Afghanistan and civilians of all creeds in Pakistan. We have the Times Square attempted car bomber, Faisal Shahzad, and he said, jihad, holy fighting in Allah's course with full force of numbers and weaponry, is given the utmost importance in Islam. By jihad, Islam is established. By abandoning jihad, may Allah protect us from that, Islam is destroyed, and Muslims go into inferior position. Their honor is lost, their lands are stolen, their rule and authority vanish. Jihad is an obligation and duty in Islam on every Muslim. A Texas would-be terrorist, Khalid al-Dosari, he said, after mastering the English language, learning how to build explosives, and continuous planning to target the infidel Americans, it's time for jihad. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, one of the 9/11 plotters, one of the masterminds of the 9/11 mass murders, he said, many thanks to God for his kind gesture and choosing us to perform the act of jihad for his cause and to defend Islam and Muslims. Therefore, addressing the American people in general, he said, killing you and fighting you, destroying you and terrorizing you, responding back to your attacks, are all considered to be a great legitimate duty in our religion. Now, I could go on, but the question then becomes, how did these men come to misunderstand this peaceful religion so spectacularly? How did these men, many of whom and many others like them, dedicated their lives to studying the Quran, to studying the teachings of Muhammad and the rulings of the various schools of Islamic law? Where did they get the idea that Islam commanded warfare against unbelievers if it really doesn't? If it's just a matter of some benign comments about self-defense? The answer to that question takes us into the Quran itself. Now, there have been many Quran quotes that we heard from Mr. Thompson earlier, and many Quran quotes from Mr. Akyol and Mr. Lewis. And so I can gild the lily and quote a few more, and I will do as much as time permits. But I think that it's important that we not just take these things in an isolated way, but as we are constantly exhorted to do by Muslim spokesmen, to understand them in context. And so, for example, when you have this, fight those who believe not in Allah, nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which hath been forbidden by Allah and his messenger, nor acknowledge the religion of truth, even if they are of the people of the book. And remember, Mr. Akyol told us that was the honorific given to primarily Jews and Christians in the Quran. And so this Quran verse is saying to fight against even the people of the book until they pay the jizya, the special tax on non-Muslims, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. No, that's the quote. How are we to understand it? Let's go to the Islamic scholars who talk about it. And then we come to, for example, Sayyid Abul Ala Maududi. Maulana Maududi was a 20th century Pakistani politician and Islamic theologian. He wrote an extensive commentary on the Quran. He died in 1979. He's very mainstream. If you go into the local Islamic bookstore, and I'm sure there's one right around here, you will, I guarantee you, find extensive writings by Maududi available for sale, including perhaps this Quran itself, which was graciously given to me in the Finsbury Park Mosque in London when I visited a few years back. Finsbury Park Mosque was the home of Abu Hamza al-Masri, who was also quoted earlier by Mr. Thompson, who is now in prison for various jihad terror activities. But I went in, they didn't know who I was talking to the people, very nice people there, and they gave me quite a few books on Islam, including this Quran, and I said, didn't you have some trouble here a few years back? And he said, yes, but that's all done now. Now we're all moderates. So this is the moderate Quran they gave me. And it's very helpful because it has commentary on the verses. So I just read the verse. Fight even the people of the book until they submit to your rule, which means in Islamic law a state of debasement and humiliation that denies basic rights to the Jews and Christians. Now, this is how Maududi explains the verse. He says, the purpose for which the Muslims are required to fight is not, as one might think, to compel the unbelievers into embracing Islam. Well, that's a relief. They're not to fight in order to force non-Muslims to convert to Islam. Great, except he doesn't stop there. Then he goes on to say this, rather, its purpose is to put an end to the suzerainty, the rule, of the unbelievers, so that the latter, the unbelievers, are unable to rule over people. The authority to rule, you'll notice that these are sweeping general statements, not the authority to rule in Muslim lands, or the authority to rule Pakistan, or the authority to rule the Palestinian territories, but the authority to rule all over the world. The authority to rule should only be vested in those who follow the true faith. Unbelievers who do not follow this true faith should live in a state of subordination. Anyone who becomes convinced of the truth of Islam may accept the faith of his or her own volition. The unbelievers are required to pay the jizya, the poll tax, in return for the security provided to them as the dhimmis, protected people of an Islamic state. The jizya symbolizes the submission of the unbelievers to the suzerainty, the rule of Islam. So in other words, one of the leading Islamic theologians of the 20th century says that the verse that I quoted means that Muslims must fight against non-Muslims in order to dislodge them from political power. He says that explicitly in his larger commentary on the same verse. He says, non-Muslims have no right to wield the reins of power in any part of God's earth, and if they do, it is the responsibility of the believers to dislodge them from that power by any means possible. Now, you note that this is based on not that the unbelievers have attacked the Muslims, but solely on the basis of the fact that they are unbelievers. That is the only criterion that is given for this call to warfare. Now, there is a great deal more that Mr. Lewis raised that I think we, as time permits, I will try to respond to all of it at this point so that we can be on the same page going into the next round. Certainly, we're in total agreement when he says that people say Islam is the Boston bombing, Islam is 9/11, Islam is Bali bombing, et cetera, that we cannot characterize Islam by these incidents any more than we can characterize the United States by various alleged atrocities that the United States may have committed. Certainly, I am in total agreement with that, because the actions of any particular believer or adherent or member of any group cannot necessarily be ascribed to the group or attributed to the nature of the group itself. You have to look at the teachings of the group in order to understand whether or not the actions of the believer coincide. And so that's what I'm doing now, looking at the actual teachings of the Quran and the actual ways in which Islamic scholars interpret those teachings so as to understand whether 9/11 and Boston and so on coincide with Islamic teaching or not. Now, he says, and so in that we're in total agreement. But then he says in the first place that Islam does not tell you that you can lie to promote Islam. Now here again, don't listen to me. Let's go to Maududi. Maududi says, this is in the commentary on chapter 3, verse 28, which says, let not the believers take unbelievers as their awliya, and indeed that is the word wali, guardians or protectors, in preference to believers. Whoever does this has nothing to do with Allah, unless you are doing it to guard yourselves against them. So in other words, there's some way that you can guard yourselves against the unbelievers, if you're a Muslim, by pretending to take them as your guardians and protectors. And so Maududi says this means that it is lawful for a believer, helpless in the grip of the enemies of Islam, and in imminent danger of severe wrong and persecution. And so it seems that we're all in agreement here that this is something you only do in extreme cases.
5
to keep
minutes,
his
Robert.
faith concealed and to behave in such manner as to create the impression that he is on the same side as his enemies. So you do that only in a case of severe wrong and persecution or an imminent danger. The question then becomes, what constitutes that? When people like Faisal Shahzad and various others, Betullah Mahsoud and the others that I quoted earlier, and other jihadis are saying that the U.S. is at war with Islam. Even the supposedly moderate Council on American Islamic Relations, a Hamas-linked Muslim Brotherhood front group here in the United States that masquerades as a civil rights organization, even they have said the U.S. is at war with Islam. If the U.S. is at war with Islam, that means that every Muslim is in danger in the U.S. This is something they would have us believe. And they would have us believe that when I speak the truth about Islamic teachings, that this somehow puts innocent people into danger. Well, that would trigger this dishonesty in that case, if it were necessary. And so, unfortunately, the extreme condition under which this kicks in is not all that extreme by the account of the Muslim authorities themselves, who say that this state of war exists, which Barack Obama, as we know, has repeatedly denied, and George Bush has repeatedly denied that we're at war with Islam. Nonetheless, these Muslim leaders insist that we are. Well, then, they're all in danger. As far as abrogation goes, it's based on chapter 2, verse 106 of the Quran, which says that when Allah says, whenever we, he always refers to himself in the royal we, whenever we abrogate or cause to be forgotten a verse, we will replace it with one similar or superior. And so it is based on the Quran itself, which is the highest authority in Islam, that there is abrogation under some circumstances. Mr. Lewis quoted Ahmad von Denfer, a German convert to Islam, an expert in the the interpretation of the Quran, quite rightly saying that there's no set agreement on which verses have been abrogated, which verses have not. There's quite a bit of disagreement. Some say no verses of the Quran have been abrogated at all. On the other hand, As-Suyuti, another Muslim scholar, says that 164 verses of peace were abrogated by the verse of the sword, chapter 9, verse 29, slay the unbelievers wherever you find them, and the verse chapter 9, verse 29 that I quoted earlier about fighting the Jews and Christians. There are stages there is a tradition in the interpretation of the Quran that goes all the way back to the 8th century, to Muhammad's first biographer, Ibn Ishaq. And Ibn Ishaq says that defensive jihad is indeed a stage of the teaching of the Quran, but it's not the only one. And he says that Allah first allowed Muslims to wage defensive warfare, but it was not Allah's last word on the circumstances in which Muslims should fight. Ibn Ishaq explains offensive jihad by invoking a Quranic verse. Then God, after explaining about the defense, says, fight them until there will be no more seduction. That is, people will not be drawn away from Islam. Fight them until the religion is all for Allah. That's chapter 8, verse 39 of the Quran. In other words, the fighting continues until everyone is Muslim or subjugated under the rule of Islam as the Zimmis. So the same thing is taught by Ibn Qayyim, a medieval Muslim scholar. He says, for 13 years after the beginning of his messengership, Muhammad called people to God through preaching, without fighting or jizya, and was commanded to restrain himself and to practice patience and forbearance. Then he was commanded to migrate, and later permission was given to fight. Same thing, the 20th century Chief Justice of Saudi Arabia, who I believe Mr. Thompson also quoted, says the same thing, that there are 3 stages of development in the Quran's teaching about jihad. First tolerance, then defensive warfare, and then offensive warfare. Now, it is absolutely true that not all Islamic authorities teach this, and that's certainly true in an even larger sense that most Muslims are not going to be waging jihad warfare in any sense against non-Muslims, because most people of every creed just want to live their lives and raise their families and have a job and be left alone.
1 minute.
The fact, however, remains that the existence of these teachings and their rootedness in the Quran and in the teachings of Muhammad and in the schools of Islamic jurisprudence, and we can get into more of that later on, the fact that these teachings exist means that as long as they are believed, there will be some Muslims who will believe that it is their responsibility to wage war against and to kill non-Muslims solely for the crime of being non-Muslim, and to subjugate others, denying them rights. This means it ain't a religion of peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Shadid, you will have 7 minutes for rebuttal.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's see. He starts off mentioning Taliban fighters and other ignorant terrorist criminals who have no official education in Islam. And now if I did that to you as Catholics, would you accept that? You wouldn't, right? He gave his own understanding of what he thinks taqiyya is. But look, let's go to what trained and educated people in Islam have to say. Okay? Again, the Quran is clear. The Quran, not people who are, uneducated, people fighting somewhere. What does the Quran say is the argument here, right? We're here to debate, is Islam a religion of peace? Not what the Taliban says or uneducated criminals perpetrating acts. And this is what the scholars call these people. They tell us that these people are criminals. They're not educated. They have no official position to be giving religious edicts or anything of this sort. Okay? So, let's go. The Quran says very clearly, and again, like I said, these verses have not been abrogated. The Quran makes it clear in chapter 2, verse 256, there is no compulsion in religion. Truly, the right way has been clearly distinct from error. Therefore, whoever disbelieves in the shaitan and believes in Allah has indeed laid hold on the firmest handhold, which shall not break. Allah is hearing, knowing. The Quran says in chapter 42, verse 48, but if they turn away, meaning if you turn away from the invitation to Islam, you reject it, it says that we have not sent you as a guardian over them. Your job is only to convey the message. So if somebody's coming on talking about, well, yes, Maududi, what about the other scholars, though, who say the opposite of what Maududi says? You see, and then don't fall for this claim of, oh, this is the most, prominent Islamic, come on. That's a matter of opinion. There are plenty of other scholars in Islam besides Maududi who are just as prominent, who say otherwise, all right? And we can give you some of them. Okay, for example, we have Imam al-Ghazali, a very famous and prominent scholar. He says the thematic commentary on the Quran, in the thematic commentary on the Quran, the allegation that 120 verses on the invitation to Islam were abrogated by the supposed verse of the sword. By the way, this name, verse of the sword, was not even a name made up by the Muhammad, Allah, the companions. This name was made up later. He says that the claim that all these verses were abrogated by the supposed verse of the sword is in fact one of the crassest stupidity, and only serves to show that a great number of Muslims are in a state of regression of either knowledge or intelligence in our time and have become ignorant of the Quran. He mentioned Imam Sayyuti. Imam Sayyuti specifically discusses this verse in relation to other verses of peace, patience, and forgiving. Sayyuti explains that contrary to what some imams believed, and by the way, the people he mentioned, Times Square bomber, these people are not imams. These are not educated people in Islam. He says, contrary to what some imams believe, this is not a case of abrogation, but rather of context. In certain situations, the verses of patience and forbearing apply, while in other situations, the verse of the sword applies. No verse was completely abolished by another, but rather each has a specific context and applicability. Okay? Imam Tabari says further, he says that God speaks in general. He's referring to chapter 60, verse 8, which I mentioned earlier. That's the verse that says that as long as the people are not trying to fight you for your religion or drive you from your land or your homes, to act kindly and just with those people. Tabari explains that God speaks in general of any group that does not openly fight against Muslims or drive them out of their homes. And the opinion that kindness was abrogated by later Quranic verses makes no sense. Okay? He mentioned 929. Well, let's see, what is the understanding of 929? Muhammad Asad in his commentary says that about 929. He says 929 is consistent with verses throughout the Quran concerning just cause and self-defense. He says, in accordance with the fundamental principle observed throughout my interpretation of the Quran, all its statements and ordinances are mutually complementary and cannot therefore be correctly understood unless they are considered part of one integral whole, which is what I said earlier. The Quran interprets the Quran. So you can't take the verse 929 and ignore that the other verses of the Quran clearly are telling Muslims to fight for specific reasons, such as when you're attacked, when war is made against you, against oppression. So Muhammad Asad is saying this is the context in which 929 is being read. He says this verse, 929, must too be read in the context of the clear-cut Quranic rule that war is permitted only in defense. In other words, the above injunction to fight is relevant only in the event of aggression committed against the Muslim community or state, or in the presence of an unmistakable threat to its security. Further, the other scholars of Islam say, for example, that this verse, in fact, was revealed in an instance of self-defense. It says that in the book, in the Sealed Nectar by Safi ur-Rahman, he says 929 was revealed addressing what was called the Battle of Tabuk, on the issue of the Romans who were planning a surprise attack against the Muslims. In another book known as Tabakat, Volume 2, page 165, it tells us that the fall of the government of Mecca and the adoption of Islam by prominent chiefs of Arabia and the bravery and sacrifices of the Muslim warriors made the Roman emperor decide to launch a surprise attack against the Muslims with the help of a well-equipped army. So from the Islamic sources, it is looked upon that this verse is revealed in the context of self-defense.
1 minute.
Okay? So, we're going to quote scholars. We can quote scholars who say something else. I can quote scholars who say something else. But the main point is what? The Quran says that when you differ, you bring it back to Allah. So the verses of the Quran are clear that what? There's no compulsion. That if they turn away, your job is only to deliver the message. The Quran clearly endorses making peace agreements and peace treaties with non-believers. And the situation does not have to be where another nation is subjugated. As I mentioned already, Tabari in his book, the Book of Jihad, clearly says that the scholars are unanimously in agreement that the messenger did make peace agreements. Okay? So indeed, Islam is a religion of peace.
Thank you, Shadid. Robert, you will have 7 minutes for rebuttal.
Thank you. The terrorists that I quoted at the beginning were by way of illustration that there is a problem, that somehow rank and file ordinary Muslims, many of whom are deeply committed to their religion, they have gotten the idea that there is some mandate to wage war against unbelievers in Islam. It's the same thing with these scholars. I readily acknowledged in the opening talk that there are other scholars who disagree. But then one wonders if the only scholars who have any credibility are the ones that Mr. Lewis is quoting, then where did these other scholars go wrong? How did they come to misunderstand the teachings of Islam? Could it be that they were heeding statements of Muhammad like this one, I have been commanded to fight against people until they confess that there is no God but Allah, and I am his messenger, and when they do that, their lives and property will be safe. In other words, the lives and property of the unbelievers will not be safe until they confess that there's no God but Allah and that Muhammad is his messenger, or submit and pay the jizya and are denied basic rights under the rule of the Muslims. These things didn't arise in a vacuum. These things are not just the crazy misunderstandings of a group of violent people. When you have leading scholars like the Chief Justice of Saudi Arabia saying that, and one of the most influential Islamic scholars in the world, and there are many others whom I'll quote in a minute, who say that the third and final stage of Quranic development is offensive jihad, not just defensive. The verse that there's no compulsion in religion is completely irrelevant because, as I said right at the beginning, quoting Maududi, there is no compulsion in terms of the non-believers are not forced to accept Islam. They can live as the humiliated and subjugated dhimmis under the rule of Islam. Then they're not compelled to accept Islam, except that is the only way that they have to restore a decent life. Also, Mr. Lewis is making a great deal about peace treaties. So here again, don't listen to me. Let's go to Al-Azhar University in Cairo, which has been praised by the New York Times right after 9/11 as a beacon of Islamic moderation. And has been, Barack Obama spoke there on June 4th, 2009, and praised it as a haven of Islamic scholarship and learning. And it is indeed the most influential Islamic institution among Sunni Muslims around the world. And it's very ancient and very respected. Now, this is a book of Islamic law, Reliance of the Traveler, that these scholars of Al-Azhar have certified, says here, that it conforms to the practice and faith of the Orthodox Sunni community. And so you have some of the leading scholars in the Islamic world certifying this as being expressing the faith of Sunni Muslims, who are 85 to 90% of Muslims around the world. And it says this: jihad means to war against non-Muslims, and is etymologically derived from the word mujahada, signifying warfare to establish the religion. And then it goes on to give various Quran verses to justify that, including fighting is prescribed for you, chapter 2, verse 216, slay them wherever you find them, which they say is at 489, it's also at 2:191 and 9:5, and fight the idolaters utterly, 936. Now, what about treaties? It says this, that that jihad is a communal obligation. It becomes personally obligatory for everyone when a Muslim land is attacked. The objective is to make war upon Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians until they become Muslim, or else pay the non-Muslim poll tax. And it says truces. Interests that justify making a truce are such things as Muslim weakness because of lack of numbers or materiel, or the hope of an enemy becoming Muslim. And then it refers to the incident in Muhammad's career that Mr. Lewis refers to. For the Prophet made a truce in the year Mecca was liberated with Safwan ibn Umayyah. He was the commander of the pagan force of the Quraysh. Muhammad was a member of the tribe of the Quraysh, but they had rejected his claim to be a prophet, and they fought a series of wars until Muhammad conquered them. Now, they made this treaty for 4 months in the hope that Safwan, the non-Muslim commander, would become Muslim. And he entered Islam before its time was up. if Muslims are weak, a truce may be made for 10 years if necessary. For the Prophet made a truce with Quraysh for that long. It is not permissible to stipulate longer than that. You know, I see these things on the news, people saying, oh, Hamas wants a truce for 10 years. Isn't that wonderful? There will be peace in our time. And I think if you knew anything about Islamic law for making truces, you would know this is just something that they are using to gather strength to fight again more effectively later. And that is the peace that is offered. As far as abrogation goes, I'm not particularly wedded to the idea because I'm aware that there are many Muslim scholars who say that it's not so much that verses of the Quran are actually canceled, but that they simply are superseded in terms of condition, that various conditions prevail in which Muslims behave in one way or in another. And remember, there are 3 stages of jihad teaching according to the Quran, according to Muhammad's first biographer, Ibn Ishaq, scholars all through Islamic history, going up to the Chief Justice of Saudi Arabia in the 1960s, saying that there's first tolerance, then defensive warfare, and then offensive warfare. Many interpret the relationship of them this way, that when the Muslims are in a country, they are small in number and weak, and they face a much superior force, then they preach tolerance. Not so much tolerance for the unbelievers, tolerance for themselves. Then, when they grow in sufficient numbers as to start to threaten the established order and to work to establish Islamic law, then they can defend themselves against attacks. And finally, when they have the power to do so, then they can wage offensive warfare. That would not abrogate any of these statements. It's just a matter of different conditions. As far as the Battle of Tabuk goes, Mr. Lewis mentioned it as that the Romans were planning a surprise attack. Actually, in the Islamic text, the earliest Islamic texts about this battle, there's no mention of that whatsoever. The Romans didn't even know that the Muslims were there at that time. Muhammad made a completely gratuitous expedition to the Byzantine garrison in southern Syria or northern Arabia, depending on where you draw the border, of Tabuk, where the Byzantines actually left before he got there. If they had been itching for a fight, that's unlikely. They left before he got there, probably because they didn't know he was coming, and they just moved to a different place. But this was the occasion for the revelation of chapter 9 of the Quran, which contains those passages exhorting offensive warfare against Jews and Christians solely for the crime of being Jews and Christians. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. Once again, we will have some time. We have 45 minutes right now for cross-examination and for questions and answers. Once again, you can fill out your cards. The shorter the question, the more likely it is that it will be answered. If you write on both sides of the card, you're probably not going to receive a response. So, and as Al prepares, Shadid, Robert, prepare your cross-examination questions.
What we'll do is we'll try to make it a minute to ask the question and 2 minutes to respond. How's that? Is it satisfactory? We'll won't be especially rigid about it, but I want to make sure we stay in bounds anyways. Shadid, you want to lead off with your cross-examination to Robert?
Okay, let's see. Is the mic on? Let's see. You mentioned Al-Azhar University. Are you aware of other scholars at the same university? For example, Sheikh Abdul Mujid Sub, who explained the 3 stages of jihad, and he said that they were as such. He says defensive jihad is under condition of repelling aggression, whereas preemptive jihad is done only when the Muslim nation seriously expects a treason or an attack against its territories from its enemies. He says Islam prohibits attacking those who do not fight. Therefore, he says they are defensive, liberating war, and preemptive. And the preemptive is when the Muslims expect an attack. This is from Al-Azhar University as well.
Okay. Robert?
Actually I am, and I'm very glad to see that. The problem with it is that aggression in many Islamic juridical contexts is often classified, I should say, rather, unbelief is classified as aggression, and that it itself constitutes an attack upon the Muslims, that the non-Muslims have the temerity to reject Muhammad and Islam. That is, here again, not a universal view, but the problem is that it is held. And as long as it is held, the question would then become, and I can use this time, actually, I can ask a question now myself, right? So how do you propose to eradicate the teachings from the scholars of Al-Azhar that I've outlined here, many other scholars that I haven't had time to quote, but I have them here. Maybe we'll get time. In any case, how would you propose to fight against, within the Muslim community, the understandings of Islam that give rise to violence and terrorism?
Well, the answer is that these teachings are already there. And there are just as many scholars who hold the position that, for example, you mentioned the I have been ordered to fight hadith. What he didn't tell you, though, is that the majority opinion, this is from Imam al-Nawawi's book called The 40 Hadith, says that the majority of the Muslim jurists understand this hadith that it was only referring to the pagan Arabs. This is not, they don't understand this verse, this hadith as a command for Muslims to go out and attack everybody until they submit to Islam. The majority of the jurists understand that this hadith only was referring to the pagan Arabs. Others say that this hadith was actually abrogated by the many verses of the Quran, because they can't deny that there are over a dozen verses. I have them here with me. If we have time, I'll get to them as well. That there are over a dozen verses where Muhammad and the Muslims are constantly being told that if they turn away, your job is only to deliver the message. If they reject you, your job is only to deliver the message. If they turn away, your job is only to deliver the message. So the scholars had to come to the conclusion, well, then if this hadith is accurate, then it has to be abrogated because the Quran is the top source in Islam. And that's the thing I want you to understand, everyone, that you can find all kinds of scholars, even in Christianity. I have stuff from Thomas Aquinas here, who talks about how the Jews are supposed to be put in perpetual servitude. I have decrees from papal bulls who give decrees that, you know, the Catholic rulers can just run over any infidels and heathens and put them in perpetual servitude. So you have those beliefs there as well. You see, the point is, what does the text of Islam say? The highest source of Quran, as I have mentioned, clearly outlines peaceful relations, no forcing. If they turn away, your job is only to deliver the message. So the way we combat that is by making sure people understand the correct Islamic position. Unfortunately, you'll never be able to get rid of these different perspectives. Even in Catholicism, these things are there.
Well,
but
actually,
the point
no.
is if we can direct people to these correct opinions.
Hold on.
Actually, there is no...
We will go to the question here of settling of doctrinal authority, because this has come up before. It came up this morning. We weren't unable to get to it, so it allows me to actually pick up on something that I was going to get to later anyways, and that is, isn't part of the problem here that Islam has no central interpretive authority? Consequently, Islam is more easily, or the Quran is more easily hijacked by people of ill will. And I'll let you begin with that, Robert.
Okay, well, there are a couple things also that I think are important to respond to. Thomas Aquinas, as wise and as influential and important as he is not infallible or authoritative in terms of Catholic doctrine. And so to quote him in something that was never part of official church teaching is a bit disingenuous. When there is no central authority in Islam, it's true, but there are the ulama, the religious scholars of various countries, and the institutions like Al-Azhar that have extraordinarily great influence. And so when you have these teachings being propagated at high levels, as they often are, like by authorities like the Chief Justice of Saudi Arabia and so on, then it's very difficult to go against them. You also have various schools of jurisprudence. In Sunni Islam, there are 4 schools of jurisprudence: Maliki, Hanafi, Hanbali, and Shafi'i, to which Muslims all generally, the Sunnis all generally belong to one or the other. And they all, I have the quotes here, teach jihad warfare in various ways as well. But I have to get in this because Mr. Lewis has twice referred to this passage of the Quran which says if they reject the message, then turn away. He's not quoting this other one which says this: they but wish that you would reject faith as they do. So we're talking about people who reject faith and thus be on the same footing as they. So don't take allies from their ranks until they emigrate in the way of Allah, that is, until they leave their homes and join the Muslims. But if they turn renegade, that is, if they leave the faith, seize them and kill them wherever you find them. That's chapter 4, verse 89. And so there is a verse that says, if they reject you, turn away. And there's a verse that says, if they reject you, seize them and kill them wherever you find them. We could wish that all Muslims would only pay attention to the one and not the other. They're both in the most authoritative source of Islam. They both have many scholars backing up the teaching that is there. And this is the great difficulty. I'm not saying, never said from the beginning, that all Muslims believe these things or that all scholars say these things. But the reality of these teachings, backed up by scholars of great influence and power, means that violence in Islam has been a constant through its history and is a constant today, justified by the texts and teachings of Islam, which demonstrates the proposition before us today that it is not a religion of peace.
Shadid, let me throw the same question to you, and then feel free to piggyback on it, response to Robert. And that is, one of the complaints heard earlier today from people on the floor is that is it because there's no, in Catholicism, there's a, quote, infallible teaching authority. Nothing quite like that in Islam. You do have respected centers of authority, but no universal teaching authority. Is that part of the problem? That the Quran, the interpretation of the Quran can be hijacked by self-appointed, for instance, Osama bin Laden's?
I would say, yeah, that's a problem, because what's happening is the scholarship is being disrespected. These people, like Osama bin Laden, whose family comes from a construction company family, he has no official, education in Islam, degrees or anything like that. And so these people are appointing themselves. Basically, I was talking to someone earlier, it's like a gang leader who's appointed himself as the gang leader. And yeah, some people want to, follow him and listen to this person. But in actuality, this person has no authority, no official authority, just people who want to listen and follow. So that's the problem, that the people are listening to these people and following them, and not acknowledging the fact that, well, hold on, this person has no actual official authority or official education in Islam. And then to piggyback on Robert, he mentioned the verse 489, but what he didn't tell you, everyone, which he does a lot, is that the very next verse puts an exception. It says those who renegade, except if they leave and don't attempt to fight you.
Let me just stop you for a minute, only because I want to make sure people understand. 489 is kill them wherever they find them, right? Wherever you find them.
But it's more than it. It was talking about people who renegade or turn away.
Set that up though, so that point is the point that you're making is put in the larger context.
Right. So in other words, he mentioned the part that says, oh, if they turn away, then kill them where you find them. But he's not telling you that the next verse gives the exception. It says that if they turn away, you kill them where you find, except those who have gone away and are not trying to fight you, or they go to a people with whom you've made a treaty. He's leaving that part out and just giving you the one part to make it seem like, oh, the verse is they turn away, kill them. But he's not telling you that the verse puts an exception, that if the person leaves, but they're not trying to fight the Muslim people, then leave them at peace, is what the verse says.
Okay, Robert, did you want to respond to that
Yeah, sure.
interpretation?
I happen to have it right here. Except those who join a group between whom and you there is a treaty. Well, remember what I read to you from, here again, the most important and influential institution in Sunni Islam, Al-Azhar, which says that you make a truce if you think that your enemy will become Muslim, or you need to gather strength to fight against them more effectively. So, in other words, you kill them wherever you find them, unless you think they're going to become Muslim, or you need strength to fight them better later. That's all. That's the only exception given. As far as the various authorities go, also, I have to emphasize, since Mr. Lewis quoted a scholar at Al-Azhar, a scholar at Al-Azhar is one thing, but a manual of Islamic law certified by the institution itself as conforming to the practice and faith of the Orthodox Sunni community, that has an extraordinary weight. That has a weight that's essentially saying this is Sunni Islam. And it has nothing in there about the other understanding of the Quran that he mentioned earlier. It's only the tolerance, defensive warfare, and offensive warfare stages. And the offensive warfare is a collective responsibility upon the Muslim community. It also contains the death penalty for apostates from Islam, which is in question about those who turn away, whether you leave them alone or whether you kill them, and so on. And this is a manual of Islamic law bearing the certification of one of the highest authorities in Islam. Islam has no central authority, but this is about as close to it as you can get.
Can I respond to that real quick?
Sure.
This claim about Al-Azhar actually is not true. Al-Azhar actually has been marginalized in the Muslim world for years. So the claim to try to, raise his argument, say, oh, this is the most prominent, it had that position, but now Al-Azhar has been marginalized for quite some time, because of Mubarak, the rulership of Mubarak. It's been marginalized in the Islamic world for a long time. Some Muslims even said that it even has a Sufi type of overturn to it. So don't fall for that, it's the most prominent. No. Okay, look, how about this? How about the head of the Fatwa committee at Al-Azhar? What does he say? He says here, Sheikh Atiya Sakar, he says, jihad is never a tool of waging war against innocents. It's never a means of flexing muscle or bullying the weak or the oppressed. Okay? And also the book, Reliance of the Traveler. A lot of other scholars have also discounted this book as also being a book troublesome. Some scholars have told Muslims, stay away from it. Leave that book alone. It's not good to leave it alone. So, you see, you got to know the full context if you're going to claim to be an Islamic scholar.
Yeah, Al-Azhar is so uninfluential that Barack Obama picked it to speak there when he went to make his great speech
that doesn't
to the
prove this
Muslim world.
influential. That doesn't prove it's influential.
Also,
so what?
When there's no jihad against innocents, that's true, but non-Muslims are not considered innocent.
No, that's a lie. That's a lie. That's a lie.
I can give you plenty of authorities that say so.
I can give you plenty of authorities that say the opposite.
This gets to the heart of something very important. You said non-Muslims are not considered innocents.
Yes, that's correct.
Therefore,
That's incorrect.
One is then, because they are culpable, they can be killed.
Yeah, the
They can
idea
be
is
targeted.
that everyone was born Muslim. You all were born Muslim, and you were turned away from Islam by your parents and so on. There's no concept in Islam of people who reject Islam in good faith. A paradigmatic example is when a group of Christians from the Yemeni Christian city of Najran came to visit Muhammad. This is a story in Islamic tradition. And along the way, while they're going, their leader says to them, look, we know this guy is the prophet. We know that he fulfills the prophecies in our scriptures. He's got all the signs. We know he's a prophet. But when you go there, you have to contradict him in everything and not accept anything he says, because the Byzantines are giving us money, and they'll cut us off if we accept him as a prophet. And this is really, this is a very common idea, that everyone who rejects Islam is doing so in bad faith because of a desire for material gain or some other kind of gain. And the idea that you could be in good faith and reject Islam is not in the traditions. And so there are many scholars of Islam who say, Anjem Chowdhury most famously, I believe, who is an imam in Britain, very extreme, and yes, you'll say everybody rejects him and laughs at him. Absolutely, yes. Nonetheless, he has a following himself, and there are people who take him seriously. And there are other Islamic scholars who've said the same thing, that no non-Muslim is innocent because they have all rejected Muhammad, rejected the Quran, and so on. And so when you hear Islam forbids the killing of innocents, there are many people who are saying that knowing that they are not referring to what Americans take them to be referring to when they say it.
Okay, this is good. I mean,
I
this
need to
is,
respond to that, please.
Oh, of course. Yeah. No. This goes to the heart of this debate. It seems to me. Two things, Shadid. Are non-Muslims considered? Can non-Muslims be targeted by virtue of the fact that they are non-Muslims, and because the race was originally born Muslim, those who are presently non-Muslim have become non-Muslim by some act of rejection? Is that proper, Robert? Is that the way you would put it? Yeah. Okay. And then secondly, with that is, it's related. Can one reject Islam in good faith? So.
Okay. All right. Are non-Muslims considered not innocent? Is that it?
Right, not innocent.
Right. The answer is this is incorrect. As I already gave you from the Quran, chapter 60, verse 8, makes it clear that Allah says that as long as a people, I mean, I'm sure everyone would agree with this, as long as a people are not trying to fight you or drive you from your homes, be just and kind to them. That's just a universal thing. Anyone can understand it. As long as people are not bothering you, don't bother them. That's the Quran. It's clear. So that shows you that clearly the Quran is definitely showing that, the innocence of a person is not based upon you being a Muslim. All right? Non-Muslims are indeed considered innocent, as like it says, as long as they're not trying to fight you for your religion or drive you from your homes. Here, just so we make it clear, let me read to you, again, one of the imams. In his book, Divergences of the Jurors, he says about the very verse I just mentioned, the interpretation, the most proper, he says, interpretation of Surah 60, verse 8, is that God commanded kindness and justice to be shown amongst all kinds of communities and creeds, and did not specify by his own words some communities to the exclusions of others. He mentions Anjum Chowdhury. This is what I'm saying. He's not a scholar. Andrew Chowdhury from the UK is not a scholar. He has no official position. This is what the scholars say. This is what the Quran says, everyone. The Quran is clear. You can't deny these verses. These verses are there. And it makes it clear that, no, the non-Muslim is not looked upon as not being innocent because you're not Muslim. Real quick, also quickly, this idea that you're born Muslim, that's incorrect. What Islam says is that everyone is born what they call in the Arabic word the fitrah. This means that everyone is born with a natural disposition to believe in God. Not that you are born a Muslim like me, you practice, you understand. No, everyone is born with an innate nature to have a belief in God. That's what it teaches. Not that you're born a Muslim, and so if you grow up and be something else, you're almost like, like you've rejected the Islamic faith. No, it's incorrect.
Let me put a finer point on the non-Muslim question here. Let's say in the abstract, non-Muslims are not, by virtue of being non-Muslim, culpable or guilty or ought to be targeted. In looking at looking at the world today, with the history of colonialism, the rejection of American foreign policy, certainly there are those in the Muslim world who would say that by virtue of supporting the United States foreign policy, you're non-Muslim, but you are culpable because you support U.S. foreign policy. Does that make one a combatant?
No, it does not. We have clear teachings and statements of Muhammad that spoke about fighting only those who fight you. In other words, physical fighting.
Okay.
Do not fight unless they fight you physically. He makes that clear. If someone, and matter of fact, he even says that if you're on the battlefield and the enemy drops his weapon, stop. He says, stop. Matter of fact, there was an incident where a person was fighting with the Muslims, and he had said that he dropped his weapon and said he believes in Islam now, and one of the companions still slayed him. And later this was told to Muhammad, and Muhammad was very upset with this person because he had still went on ahead and killed the person. So there are many teachers. Matter of fact, I have a book here, War, Peace, and Nonviolence, an Islamic Perspective. So these teachings are out there. There are scholars out there who are teaching this, who are writing books, who are making videos, clearly demonstrating that this is the majority opinion of Islam.
Okay. Robert, I suppose you would want to
Yeah,
respond to that?
when we're talking about whether non-Muslims are considered innocent by the majority of Muslim scholars or even a significant number of Muslim scholars, chapter 60, verse 8 about don't fight those who deal kindly and justly with you is actually irrelevant because it is only saying be nice to those who aren't fighting you, which does not necessarily mean that you are being nice to people who are innocent. It is generally considered under the framework that I explained before that is taught as authoritative by this manual from Al-Azhar and others, that there are these three stages of warfare, of tolerance, defensive jihad, and offensive jihad in Islam, that verse pertains to the stage of defensive jihad. Also, in terms of putting things in context, which is always very important, in chapter 60, you have the story of Abraham, and we're all the three great Abrahamic faiths and all that. And so a story of Abraham is very good when we're talking about the relationship between believers and unbelievers. And it says, there has been an excellent example for you. This is 60 verse 4, a few verses before that one about not fighting them. There has been an excellent example for you in Abraham and those with him. Excellent examples, very important. Uswa Hasana is the word used in the words used in the Quran, chapter 33, verse 21, to refer to Muhammad, the excellent example, the supreme guide for behavior, the person that the Muslims must emulate most. And here we're told that Muslims should also imitate Abraham. In what should they imitate Abraham? Let's read on. When they said to their people, "Verily, we are free from you and whatever you worship besides Allah. We have rejected you, and there has appeared between us and you hostility and hatred forever." until you believe in Allah alone. And so they're not fighting. They're not fighting against the Muslims. This is Abraham's family. And he's saying, there is hostility and hatred between us and you forever until you believe in Allah alone. But then it says, Abraham is not an excellent example for the believers when he said to his father, verily, I will ask forgiveness for you. So, in other words, Muslims are to imitate Abraham when he says there's hostility and hatred between us and the unbelievers forever, but not to imitate Abraham when he says to his unbelieving father, I will pray for your forgiveness. Okay. And so the idea that they should not be fought is certainly true as far as defensive jihad goes, but then there is the obligation for offensive jihad, which is clearly set out in the Quran 9:29 as being solely because the unbelievers are not Muslims, and then they are to be fought.
Please,
that is the final stage. One brief thing. In this Manual of Islamic Law and in Islamic theology in general, jihad is a general obligation. The word for this is fard kifaya, a general obligation on the community, so that if I'm fighting jihad, you don't have to. When, however, a Muslim land is attacked, then it becomes fard ayn, which is obligatory upon every Muslim individually to defend Islam, to defend the Muslim land. But that distinction in itself shows that jihad is not only defensive.
Please, can I?
Yeah, certainly. Just hold on, though, because I just want to say I'm going to have you respond, and then we're going to have to move on to something else, simply because this is, I like it, it's very good, and it's clarifying, but I think it's sometimes difficult to hang on to where the train of thought here. So please go ahead, take 2 minutes, and then what we'll do is move on to another question from the floor.
Okay, very quickly. Again, this is why you need real scholars to speak. The one Fard Kifai and Fard Ayn he's talking about, which was the individual responsibility to fight jihad and the overall, the scholars will tell you that what he just said was incorrect. The Fard Ayn, the individual, when everyone has to be responsible, the scholars will tell you that if a nation is attacked, it is the responsibility of everyone in that nation who is Muslim to have to fight. I don't have to leave America to go join another Muslim country that's being attacked. This is what the scholars of this is what he's not telling you, see? He's misinforming you people and you don't get it. This is what the scholars tell you, that injunction of when it becomes a responsibility of every Muslim, no, they say it's responsibility of every Muslim in that nation. Muslims all over the world don't have to run and join the Muslim country that's being attacked to fight. Also, he keeps talking about these three stages. Well, look, here's a book, The Rights of Islam in the Muslim World, by Dr. Salih Hussein Adyad, who talks about the three stages correctly. He says, even in war, known as jihad, can only occur for valid reasons and moral goals. It can only take place for the following reasons. Remember, now I already gave you the head of Al-Azhar University who gave you the three reasons, and they weren't what he said. Here's another one. As a response to an act of aggression, as stated by Allah, he gives the verses, as a penalty for those who break a treaty or violate a truce, as a deterrent to those who prevent people from traveling and going about, oppression and things like that, or to assist people who are being oppressed with the goal of relieving their oppression. Of course, hey, the United States does it. Don't we send troops sometimes to countries to remove tyrannical leaders and things of that nature? So why should Islam be an exception to that? Islam also speaks of going to help people and making the offense, but in the just cause, that the people are being oppressed.
Okay.
You see?
Al, 2 seconds. Those who are called upon to perform jihad when it is a communal obligation are every able-bodied man who has reached puberty and is sane. Not just the ones in the battle lines.
In that nation.
Every able-bodied man is to wage defensive
in that nation.
No, he's lying.
This book tells you in that nation.
Wait. According
so he's misinforming
Al-Azhar University.
It's in that nation.
You're qualifying it that it applies, it binds the conscience of those in that particular nation, but it doesn't bind the conscience of those outside the nation.
Right.
Robert, you're saying there's a universal
It's a universal
binding.
statement that is not qualified at all in this manual that is certified.
Well, in
as
this
the
manual,
guide
it
to
says the
Orthodox
opposite.
Sunni
Okay,
Islam.
this is the correct position. This is the correct position. And
So you are
also, it's
setting
backed up by the Quran.
You're setting yourself against Orthodox Sunni Islam.
No, I'm not, because I'm giving other officials that say the opposite, so they have authority as well.
Okay.
So no, I'm not setting myself up, because I'm giving credited officials.
Well, somebody will go and exegete this transcript sometime in the future, and we'll all find out that we missed something really big somewhere along here. But very good, thank you. Let's go to something that is a real basic question that I think we haven't asked, and that is, does Muhammad teach Muslims to turn the other cheek?
Yes, actually, there are verses in the Quran that speak about that speak about it being better to forgive, when conflict or things arise, that it is better to forgive. So you have that option. You have that option to, exact retribution because you've been wronged, but it also speaks of that if you want to forgive, that you can forgive, and this is close to righteousness as well.
Okay. Robert?
Let me tell you a story. Muhammad once was being made fun of by a poet, Ka'b bin al-Ashraf. And this poet wrote these verses that annoyed Muhammad considerably. They made fun of Muhammad. So at one point, he asked his followers, who will kill Ka'b ibn Ashraf for me? And Muhammad ibn Maslama, who was one of his followers, said, I will. And he said, but you have to give me permission to lie to him. Now remember, we were talking earlier about lying, about taqiyya, about deception in Islam, and Mr. Lewis was saying, it's only when your life is in danger. Muhammad's life was in danger. He was not in danger. He was just being made fun of by a poet. And he said, yes, you can lie to the poet. And Muhammad ibn Maslama went and lied to the poet to lure him close to him, and he murdered him, and Muhammad rewarded him for doing so. This is the basis, this and other stories like it, and there are many other stories like it, is the basis for the idea that blasphemy is a capital offense, that if you make fun of Muhammad, you criticize Muhammad, something like that, then you deserve to be killed. This is not quite turning the other cheek.
Okay. Again, wait. Again, what Robert is not telling you, that if you read that story and the Islamic understanding, this Ka'b, he was not just writing poetry. He was also inciting people, the pagans, to actually attack and fight the Muslims. This, if you read, the book is called The Sealed Nectar by Safi ar-Rahman. He talks about the actual further details, that he wasn't just a poet insulting Muhammad. He was actually inciting violence against the Muslims, to attack the Muslims, to get people to try to assassinate Muhammad and things of this nature. This is why this person was
We're just going to let that one sit. Let's pick up on this other question. When we started this, publicizing this event, we were warned by one person that if we did so, we would be subject to all kinds of protests. That was fine with us. The more publicity, the better. But I do want to know here, our CARE, I'll just read this question as it stands. Our CARE and multiple Islamic groups who tried to stop this event, quote, uneducated criminals, using your phrase earlier, Shadid, uneducated criminals with no right to speak for Islam, or is this attempt to suppress open dialogue part of a jihad in the United States to negate education about Islam?
Is it an attempt to negate education about Islam?
Yeah, I think what's being, as I understand this question, there are organs like CARE, and Robert can speak to this in detail. There are organs like CARE, organizations like CARE, and other Islamic groups that, when this was, you agreed to come, okay?
Right.
I had heard you call for a debate for Robert on a podcast that you had made, so I wasn't really thinking anything wrong. I thought this was fine. This is good stuff.
Right.
We had leaders here, Muslim leaders here, who thought that this was not merely a bad idea, but one that ought to have been stopped. And they didn't have any jurisdiction to stop it. One person tried to get the Eastern Michigan University to shut us down. Another one tried, or the same one, tried to get the Bishop of Lansing to intervene. Now, what do you make of that? Because you're here. Mm-hmm. They're not here.
Right.
We'd be glad to have them here.
Right.
But, so what do you make of it?
All right. First, when I made the statement about the uneducated criminals, that was referring to people who are attempting to do acts of terror in the name of Islam.
Taliban.
Right, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Not groups who, if they feel they well, from what I understand, I think the reason why they don't want these type of things to go forward is because I think they feel that it gives a further voice to people who they perceive as promoting negativity and bigotry about Islam. So I think this is the reason why they want to stop. The reason why I decided to do it because I feel we need to respond.
Yeah.
You see, we need to respond, because if we remain quiet, then it gives the appearance that Robert knows what he's talking about. And as I showed you, right? And as I showed you today, you see, I have the arguments to counter what he's saying. So I feel this is why I said I'm going to come, because no, we cannot allow him to continue to speak unchallenged.
And we appreciate that, by the way, really, because not because we don't trust Robert, but because we agree that in principle, really, these things are serious. These are serious matters, and
in fact,
we're not children that can't be talked with. You know,
right.
we can learn. So,
in fact, can I add too? The Quran actually welcomes this. Many people don't know this. In chapter 16, verse 25 or 125, the Quran actually says to invite the people to Islam with good speech and preaching, and to debate with them or have a dialogue or discourse with them in the best manner. So this type of thing is not against Islam. Islam actually says, yes, debate with them, talk with them, but of course do it in the best manner.
Sure. Robert, I thought this would come up earlier. It hasn't, but so I'm going to throw it to you. Why have you been banned from the United Kingdom?
Well, I was actually banned from the United Kingdom for precisely the same reason that people from Reza Aslan's Aslan Media and others were trying to shut down this event, and that is that what I say is true, and in the immortal words of Jack Nicholson in that movie whose name I forget, you can't handle the truth.
A few good men.
If only you were telling the truth.
What we have here is a very interesting situation that the UK sent a letter to me from the Home Office that said that you say these things that we think will incite Muslims to violence. And they gave an example in the letter. And the letter quoted me saying Islam has a doctrine of warfare against unbelievers, which obviously it does. And obviously many Muslims believe that it is important to act upon those doctrines. And so they were banning me for telling the truth because they were afraid Muslims would be violent in accord with those doctrines that I was saying.
You have that in a written statement?
I put their letter up on my website, Jihad Watch. You can read it for yourself. They were kowtowing, in other words, to violent intimidation. And it's the same thing with these events. Reza Aslan is in the news quite a bit these days. He's the author of a book about Jesus. People don't know, however, that he's a thuggish foe of the freedom of speech who tries to get me shut down every time I speak anywhere. And hardly the gentle follower of a reconsidered Jesus that he's presenting himself as now. And in any case, the point is that these people, like him and other enemies of the freedom of speech, they don't want to have these things aired because they know they're true. The only way they can counter them is to shut me down. Now, when it comes to Mr. Lewis, I commend him for his attempt to show that what I'm saying is false, because it obviously fails, but the reality is that at least the attempt is made, and we can have a discussion so that the truth does shine forth. And I'm glad that he did not take to heart this Quran verse, chapter 5, verse 101. O you who believe, don't ask questions about things which, if made plain to you, may cause you trouble. Some people, and skipping down a bit, some people before you did ask such questions and on that account lost their faith. There is a tremendous fear and insecurity at the heart of a great deal of the Islamic supremacist organizations and spokesmen in the United States. They can't handle the truth. They can't handle challenge. They will not be questioned, and they will not brook anyone telling the truth about Islam and jihad, and that's why I am so notorious.
Okay.
May I ask? Just very short, briefly.
Why don't you go ahead, and also, if you would, just I don't know what your attitude is towards CARE. I'd like to know what you think of...
My attitude towards CARE is I see that they seem to be like a type of Muslim NAACP, if you will. Okay. You know, always trying to fight for the rights, the civil rights of Muslims. This is what I see them as.
Okay, all right.
You know? Very quickly,
sure.
He keeps mentioning the supposed motive of the terrorists and how they keep referring to the Quran. Actually, they don't. Here's an article by Glenn Greenwald, and he has the article titled, Same Motive for Anti-U.S. Terrorism is Cited Over and Over Again. And he goes through all the statements of the people who have been accused of terrorism or arrested for any acts of terrorism. And he mentions that over and over again, they don't really cite Islam as their motive. They keep saying you know, it's the U.S. killing of the children in Afghanistan, or the killing in Yemen, or the killing of children in Iraq, you know, Muslim civilians being killed by drones, Muslim women being killed. These are the things that they keep citing over and over again. And as Brother Mustafa mentioned, this is their motive. And of course, if you're a believer in any religion, you then try to include your religion as part of it. But the motive is actually these things. Even in Woolwich, the UK of the soldier, those guys, what did they say? He said, this is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You're killing our children in our country. You've invaded our lands. This is what their motive is. And unfortunately, they're carrying out their anger or expression, about these incidents incorrectly and wrong.
The Woolwich murderer actually referred specifically to Surah At-Tawbah, which is the 9th chapter of the Quran, which contains the verse of the sword, slay the unbelievers wherever you find them, and the verse 929, chapter 9, verse 29, which says that Muslims should wage war even against Jews and Christians, the people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued.
He didn't cite
referred
that.
Specifically to Surah At-Tawbah. You look at the videotape, it's in there.
Okay, for closing statements, I'd like to invite Shadid. You have 7 minutes for your closing statement.
All right, very heated debate, very heated debate. Well, as I've shown you, it is abundantly clear that Islam, as shown from its highest source, the Quran, and other sources, and the opinions of the majority of Islamic scholars, jurists, imams, and teachers, that Islam is indeed a religion of peace. You can't deny it. Those verses are still in the Quran. Many Muslim scholars cite them and say they're still applicable and relevant. All right, I gave you the correct Islamic opinion about the conditions of the jihad, and they clearly tell you that the offensive jihad is what? If a people are oppressed and the Muslims go to help those that are being oppressed or to rescue them from being oppressed, it's clear. We mentioned, as he wants to use Al-Azhar, I mentioned the man who was the head of the committee of the fatwa saying that this is the case with jihad. As I mentioned again, as Al asks us, yes, there's a problem because of there's no central authority. But Islam answers that question. In the Quran, chapter 42, verse 10, it says, whatever it be wherein ye differ, the decision thereof is with Allah. In other words, yes, you're going to find scholars who say one thing and scholars say another. So you say there's a difference of opinion. So how do we solve this problem? We solve this problem by going then to Allah. All right? One scholar says, oh, well, fight them until they accept. The other say, no, you don't do that. Conflict. What do? Go back to the Quran. Quran says no compulsion in religion. Quran says if they turn away, your job is only to deliver the message. Quran says as long as they're not trying to fight you, that treat them kindly, treat them justly. Right? It's there. The Quran is there. So therefore, the scholars who say that it is not offensive just because they are unbelievers is the correct opinion because it is supported by what the Quran says. We also see further, to further solve this problem, is chapter 6, verse 114. It says, shall I seek a judge other than Allah? You see? Like I said, I have quotes from Thomas Aquinas. I have quotes from some of your popes who are believed to be infallible, who made decrees of perpetual servitude for Jews, that Jews should be subjugated and treated harshly. They're supposed to be infallible. Will you accept that if I quote that to you today? No. All right, then why? You're going to say, well, Jesus Christ said to love your enemy, right? You're going to go to your book, the source. Well, I'm doing the same thing. Yes, there are going to be scholars who have an extreme position and others who take a lighter position. But then I say, how do I solve this? I go to the word of Allah. And the word of Allah says that I should not be hostile with you as long as you're not trying to fight me, as long as you're not trying to drive me from my land. If you reject the message, then, my job is only to deliver the message. Treat you with kindness. This is what the Quran says. So, yes, if I hear that, well, I go and take it to the Quran, just like you would do and say, well, look, Jesus Christ said, be good to your neighbor and love your enemies, regardless of what some pope centuries ago decreed on how to treat Jews and Muslims in the past. All right? Further on, the Quran, 39:55 says, and follow the best. That is the Quran that has been revealed to you. See, Islam warns us about listening to religious leaders. Not saying that you ignore them. Yes, they have their respect. But Islam warns us about listening to religious leaders because they can sometimes take, or want power for themselves or want power for the state and use the power of religion to, garner support for earthly reasons. So Islam warns us about, blindly following religious leaders, you see? So when you hear him quote certain people and you hear me quote something else who says something different, well, understand then, take it back to the Quran and see that the Quran clearly enjoins peace. He even mentioned the verse that talks about peace agreements and making peace with the unbelievers. Okay? So Quran says in chapter 77, verse 50, so in what words after this Quran will they believe? Don't try to tell me what some committee says or what some scholar says over and above Quran when the Quran makes it clear that it is telling you that we can be peaceful with people who are not trying to fight us, so forth and so on. So again, in closing, peace or being peaceful does not mean that one must be passive. But you cannot deny that I have clearly shown to you teachings from Islam that teach and speak of not only a spiritual peace, but also of harmonious relations with both Muslims and non-Muslims. I end. Thank you.
Before Robert does his closing, there's one doctrinal point that I think has to be addressed here because it's subject of misunderstanding, and I wouldn't necessarily expect Shadid to be aware of it, but when we talk about papal infallibility, it's limited to certain types of expressions, and not everything that a pope says has enduring or binding authority. So I just want to make that clear.
Thank you.
Robert, go ahead.
Mr. Lewis keeps telling you that Muslims should not pay attention to the scholars because he knows that the scholars teach warfare against unbelievers and that Islam is not a religion of peace. The fact is that the scholars of Islam study the Quran. And so rather than tell you everything that the Quran says, which would just have come with the response, well, that's just you talking, that's not how we understand it, I have shown you today that the highest authorities in Islam understand the Quran to be teaching warfare against unbelievers. Not only Al-Azhar, which again certifies this manual as conforming to the practice and faith of the Orthodox Sunni community, and which says that the Caliph makes war upon Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians until they pay the jizya, or until they become Muslim, rather, or else pay the non-Muslim poll tax. There are 4 schools of Sunni Muslim jurisprudence that I alluded to before. The Hanafi school, a Hanafi manual of Islamic law, has the same kinds of things in it as this one. It insists that people must be called to embrace Islam before being fought, in accord with a tradition of Muhammad in which he says, when you meet the unbelievers, first invite them to accept Islam. If they refuse that, invite them to pay the jizya. If they refuse both, then seek Allah's help and fight them. And remember, Muhammad is the excellent example of conduct according to the Quran, chapter 33, verse 21, so his exhortations are authoritative. The Hanafi manual says that you call them to embrace Islam, and then from the call to Islam, the people will hence perceive that they are being attacked for the sake of religion and not for the sake of taking their property or making slaves of their children, although all that happens too. And on this consideration, it is possible that they may be induced to agree to the call to Islam. So there's no compulsion in religion. We'll just take your property and make slaves of your children if you don't enter into the faith of Islam. However, if the infidels, upon receiving the call, neither consent to it nor agree to pay the jizya, then it is incumbent upon the Muslims to call upon Allah for assistance and to make war upon them. So that's the Shafi'i school, which is Al-Azhar, the Hanafi school, the Maliki school, Ibn Khaldun, pioneering historian and philosopher. He says in the Muslim community, the holy war is a religious duty because of the universalism of the Muslim mission and the obligation to convert everybody to Islam either by persuasion or by force. This is an awful lot of high-powered misunderstanders of Islam, if what Mr. Lewis is telling you is true. The Hanbali school, Ibn Taymiyyah was a Hanbali jurist of great renown and influence to this day. He said, since lawful warfare is essentially jihad, and since, oh, that's not the next page, is it? Anyway, he says the same things, essentially. The Shiites also say the same thing. The Ayatollah Khomeini very famously said that he spits upon the foolish souls who claim that Islam means to make peace with the unbelievers rather than to make war with them. The Ayatollah Khomeini was a high authority in Sunni Islam who had dedicated his life to studying the Quran, studying the teachings of Muhammad, and so on. There are scholars who do not teach these things. Unfortunately, they don't have enough influence within the Muslim community to prevent there from being active jihad warfare being waged today all across the globe, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Thailand, in Kashmir, in Chechnya, in Nigeria, in Egypt and Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan, and in many, many other places, including Boston, Massachusetts, where the Boston jihad bomber explained that what he was doing was defending Islam. Defending Islam and taking up arms to do so is something that is hallowed and certified as being a responsibility of Muslims, indeed a communal responsibility on every Muslim when it is perceived that Islam is under attack. And so these things don't come out of nowhere. The Boston Marathon jihad bomber, it is amply documented that the two brothers grew a great deal more devout in their observance of Islam in the last couple of years before the bombings. And it is a pattern throughout when we read the writings of jihad terrorists and would-be jihad terrorists. Devout Islam is something they all share. This doesn't mean that every devout Muslim will commit violence against unbelievers, but every devout Muslim who commits violence against unbelievers is someone who is doing so because he believes that his God is commanding him to do so in his holy book. There was one who simply read the Quran, was not a member of any jihad group, any terrorist group at all. His name was Muhammad Reza Tahiri Azhar, and all he did was read the Quran. And then he decided it was his responsibility to wage war against unbelievers. Well, he was at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, my alma mater. He rented an SUV and drove it onto campus, intending to run down as many students as he could. He didn't end up killing anyone. He wounded 9 people. And then he wrote a series of very lengthy letters to the campus paper, the Daily Tar Heel, in which he explained in tremendous detail, with copious quotations from the Quran, why he thought this was his responsibility before God. Now, in conclusion, I ask you, when was the last time that you heard anybody reading the Bible and writing out an extensive explanation of why he committed acts of violence with copious verses from the Bible supporting his case? When did you last hear of that happening? Well, never. Whereas there are numerous occasions of Islamic jihadis quoting Quran, quoting various Islamic scholars, quoting Muhammad to justify warfare and violence. This didn't happen in a vacuum. It didn't happen because of Spencer misrepresenting the teachings of Islam. It didn't happen because these uneducated criminals don't know enough about their religion. It happens because the core and authoritative texts and teachings of Islam contain exhortations to violence. We can thank God that there are Muslim scholars who don't adhere to these things, and we can thank God that there are Muslims who don't pay any attention to them and never will. But it would be the height of folly to ignore that and deny their existence, and to think that they're never going to come back and bite us again, because they most assuredly will. Thank you.